AITA for stopping contributions to my wife's emergency fund after she said our marriage was over. I'm Damien, 42, and by the time the dinner happened, Leah and I had been married for 12 years. For most of those 12 years, I thought one of my better qualities was that I didn't panic easily. I paid bills before they were due. I kept receipts in a kitchen drawer because I hated hunting for them later. If we had an argument, I tried to lower my voice instead of raising it. Leah used to say she liked that about me. Somewhere along the way, responsible became controlling, and calm became cold. I didn't see the shift clearly until the night she announced she wanted out. The first few years of our marriage weren't like that. Leah was close to her mother, Judith, and her younger brother, Kyle. I actually liked that about her. She remembered birthdays, showed up when people were sick, and could spend an entire Saturday helping Judith sort through paperwork without complaining. I grew up believing that when you married someone, their family became part of your family. So when Kyle needed money for a car repair not long after our wedding, I didn't make a big deal about it. When Judith had what she called a temporary cash flow problem and needed help with an insurance payment, we helped. When Leah suggested putting Judith and Kyle on a shared phone plan because it would be cheaper, I agreed. All of those things sounded small when they happened one at a time. Then small favors developed renewal dates. Kyle always had something going on. A job that ended unexpectedly. A business idea that almost worked. A credit card he was going to pay off as soon as a check cleared. A loan that had somehow become urgent. His favorite sentence was, "I'm almost out of this hole." The problem was that the hole kept changing shape. At first, I asked questions because I thought questions were part of helping. How much do you owe? What is the interest rate? What is your payment plan? Can you reduce anything? Leah started getting irritated with me. Not everything has to be an audit, she would say. I would answer, I'm not auditing him. I'm trying to understand what we're paying for. Then Judith would step in. Money comes back. Family doesn't. It was one of those statements that sounded wise until you realized it was usually said right before someone asked you for money. The only person from Leah's side I didn't know well was her father, Peter. Leah and Judith called him the man who left. That was basically the entire biography I got. According to Leah, Peter had checked out when she and Kyle were young. Judith had held everything together. Peter had sent money only when lawyers forced him to. He had missed birthdays, skipped family events, and made Judith beg for what she was owed. I didn't question it. Why would I? Leah had no reason, as far as I knew, to lie to me about her childhood. A few times over the years, I asked why Peter never came to holidays or family gatherings. Leah would stiffen and say, because Mom doesn't want him there. If I asked anything more, she changed the subject. Once, Judith told me, some men think writing a check makes them fathers. I remember that sentence because it made me dislike Peter even though I barely knew him. So I stayed out of it. That was another habit of mine. If something seemed like old family pain, I gave it room. I thought that was respectful. Looking back, there were signs that money worked differently within Leah's family than I thought it did. Judith was always telling Leah, a woman should have money her husband can't touch. I didn't object to the principle. Leah had her own checking account. I had mine. We also had a joint checking account for household bills and a joint savings account that we had built over the years. What bothered me was how Judith applied the phrase. If Leah wanted personal savings, that was independence. If I asked why $5,000 had disappeared from joint savings, that was control. If Judith needed help, it was family. If I wanted to know whether that help was a loan or a gift, I was making Leah beg. For years, I handled that tension badly. I paid. That was my mistake. Not every time, and not without complaints, but often enough that everybody learned the same lesson. If the pressure lasted long enough, Damien would eventually cover it. I told myself I was keeping the peace. What I was really doing was teaching people that peace had a price, and I was willing to pay it. The dinner where everything finally broke was at Judith's house. It was supposed to be a normal meal. Nothing fancy. Chicken, roasted potatoes, salad. The kind of dinner where people sit around talking long after the food is cold. Kyle had been unusually quiet. That should have warned me. Judith finally put down her fork and said, "We need to discuss something as a family." I almost laughed because whenever Judith said, as a family, it usually meant a decision had already been made and I was being informed of my share. Kyle rubbed both hands over his face. "I've got a problem." I said, What kind of problem? He glanced at Leah before answering. That was the second warning. He had taken on debt connected to one of his latest attempts to get ahead. Some of it was credit. Some of it was money he had borrowed to cover earlier payments. The numbers were messy. I asked how much. Kyle gave me a number that was high enough to make me stop eating. Then Judith said, he doesn't need a lecture. He needs help. I haven't given him a lecture. You're already doing that thing with your face. I looked at Leah. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Then she said, we have enough in savings to get him through this. That sentence bothered me for two reasons. First, she said, get him through this, as if the debt were a weather event. Second, she said it as if our savings had already been volunteered. I put my fork down. How much are you asking us to use? Kyle said, I was going to pay it back. That wasn't my question. Leah exhaled sharply. Damien. What? Don't interrogate him. I'm asking how much money you want us to put toward his debt. Judith leaned back in her chair. It's not charity. It's family. I looked at Kyle. How much? He muttered a figure. It was large enough that I immediately said no. Not loudly. Just no. Leah stared at me. What do you mean, no? I mean, I'm not agreeing to use that much from our savings to cover another debt for Kyle when we don't even have a repayment plan. Kyle looked embarrassed. Judith looked offended on his behalf. Leah said, you always do this. Do what? Turn everything into numbers. It is literally a discussion about money. That's not the point. Then what is the point? The point is that my brother needs help. And the last time he needed help, we helped. And the time before that. Kyle snapped, I paid some of that back. I looked at him. Some. Leah pushed her plate away. You make people feel small. That surprised me. I asked what he owes. You ask questions like everybody has to justify themselves to you. If we're using joint savings, yes, we both have to justify it. Judith shook her head. A good husband doesn't make his wife beg to help her mother and brother. I hadn't raised my voice once, but I could feel something changing in the room. This was no longer about Kyle's debt. Leah had tears in her eyes, but she was angry, not sad. Then she said it. I'm done being married to a man who counts every dollar. There was a second where I thought she might take it back. She didn't. Judith looked almost satisfied. Kyle stared at the table, and I realized something that made me colder than the words themselves. Leah wasn't improvising. She had thought about saying that. Maybe not at that exact dinner, but the idea had already been living in her head. I leaned back in my chair. Good, I said, because I stopped being your emergency fund last week. That got everybody's attention. Leah's expression changed. What does that mean? It means I'm done paying bills for people who treat questions like insults. Judith said, so this is punishment. No, this is me saying no. Leah stood up. You are unbelievable. I got my coat. Nobody stopped me. On the drive home, I kept replaying one phrase. Emergency fund. I had used it because I was angry, but it reminded me of something. For several weeks, I had noticed our savings balance looked lower than I expected. Not dramatically lower, at least not at first glance. Leah and I had a habit of moving money in and out for larger expenses, so I had assumed I was forgetting something. When I got home, I didn't turn on the television. I didn't call anybody. I went straight to the laptop and logged into our joint savings account. Then I pulled the statements. The first transfer I noticed was labeled family. The second said JTemp. The third said house help. There were others. None of the memos meant anything by themselves. Together, they added up to $28,600. I checked the dates twice. Then a third time. Some transfers had gone to an account connected to Judith. Others had been routed in smaller amounts after that. I sat at the kitchen table until after midnight with statements spread around me and that stupid receipt drawer 3 feet away. For years, Leah had made fun of that drawer. Damien's Museum of Proof, she called it. That night, for the first time, I understood why she had started hating it. The next morning, I asked her directly. She had slept in the guest room. I put the statements on the counter. What is this? She glanced down. Her face changed for half a second, then she recovered. I told you I helped Mom. You told me we helped your mom a few times. We did. This is $28,600. It wasn't all for Mom. I know. She folded her arms. Kyle needed help too. Did you ask me? You would have said no. That is not an answer. It is absolutely an answer. No, it's the reason you hid it. I didn't hide it. The transfers are labeled family and house help. You never told me the total. That is hiding it. She looked away. It was temporary. What's the repayment plan? Silence. Leah, what is the repayment plan? She turned back toward me. You're proving my point. What point? That money matters more to you than people. I remember staring at her and realizing how completely impossible that sentence was to answer. If I defended myself, I was talking about money again. If I said nothing, I was admitting she was right. I pointed to the statement. This is our money. You didn't need permission to help your family with your own money. You needed honesty before using ours. You made me feel like I had to hide it. That was the moment the argument stopped being about whether she had done something wrong. She had already decided my reaction caused her deception. I said, I didn't make you transfer $28,000. She started crying. Not dramatically, quietly. I can't keep choosing between you and my family. I never asked you to. You do every time you say no. That sentence stuck with me. In Leah's mind, any boundary that didn't produce the result Judith wanted became a demand that she choose. I left the room because I didn't trust myself to keep talking without becoming cruel. Over the next few days, I started getting calls. Not a group chat. Nothing that organized. One cousin texted asking if I was really making Leah ask permission before helping Judith with groceries. An uncle called and told me marriage wasn't supposed to be a financial dictatorship. Rosa, Leah's cousin, sent me a message that was gentler than the others. She wrote, I don't know what's going on, but Leah says she has had to hide normal spending because you monitor everything. If that's true, you two need help. That was the first time I saw the phrase in writing. Monitor everything. I called Rosa. What exactly did Leah tell you? There was a pause. She said you control the accounts. We both have access. She said you question every purchase. I ask about large transfers. How large? I said, $28,600. Silence. Then Rosa said, she didn't tell me that. Of course she hadn't. Over the next week, the pattern became clear. Leah had been telling people I wouldn't allow her to help Judith. She left out the phone bills I had been paying. She left out the insurance payment. She left out the money that had already gone to Kyle. She left out the fact that the savings account was joint. In her version, I was a husband with a calculator, standing between a daughter and her struggling mother. That was when I stopped trying to fix the argument and started protecting myself. I changed my direct deposit so my income went into my individual account. I left enough in the joint checking account to cover my share of legitimate household expenses while we were still under the same roof. I removed Leah as an authorized user from a credit card tied only to my personal account. I didn't touch her personal account. I didn't drain the joint accounts. I didn't cancel utilities. I simply stopped allowing money that was mine alone to remain available for everyone else's emergencies. I also stopped paying Judith's phone bill. I stopped covering Kyle's portion of the family plan. I stopped the small automatic insurance payment I had been making for Judith temporarily for almost 2 years. The reaction was immediate. Judith called me. You are punishing me because you're angry at my daughter. No, I am no longer paying your bills. After everything I've done for this family? I'm not discussing this. You think money gives you power. No, I think my money gives me responsibility for where my money goes. She hung up on me. Leah came home that night furious. You cut off Mom's phone. I stopped paying for it. That is the same thing. No, it isn't. She's 64. She can have a phone. I am not required to pay for it. Leah stared at me like I had become somebody else. Maybe I had. Or maybe I had finally stopped performing the version of myself everyone preferred. A few days later, Leah told me she wanted a formal separation. I agreed. That seemed to surprise her more than anything else. She said, You're not even going to fight for us. I said, What would fighting for us look like? You know what I mean. I don't. She shook her head. You always do that. You turn feelings into questions. I'm asking what you want. I wanted you to show me I mattered more than money. You transferred almost $30,000 behind my back and then told people I controlled you. She started crying again. I said I was done because I wanted you to fight for me. I didn't know what to do with that. The 12 years behind us mattered to me. She mattered to me. But I couldn't unhear the logic. She had threatened to end the marriage in front of her family because she wanted me to prove love by surrendering the boundaries she disliked. I moved out 2 weeks later. Not because a lawyer told me to. Not because I wanted to abandon the house. I just needed physical distance from a situation where every conversation turned into the same loop. The place I rented was smaller than our home. It had a narrow kitchen, a small dining table, and several boxes I didn't bother unpacking right away. The first night there, I opened a drawer under the counter and laughed despite myself. It was the obvious place for receipts. I put exactly one in it. A grocery receipt. Then I closed the drawer. Around that time, I got a text from Peter. I almost ignored it. He and I had exchanged maybe a dozen messages in 12 years. Usually birthday acknowledgments or something practical. Months earlier, he had sent me a strange message that said, "We should talk before you sign anything." At the time, there was nothing to sign, so I assumed he was confused or trying to insert himself into family business. I never answered. This new message was different. Leah asked me to say something about you that isn't true. I read it 3 times. Then I wrote back, "What did she ask you to say?" He replied, that you control her access to money and that I had seen it myself. My stomach dropped. I called him. Peter answered on the second ring. He sounded tired. Not dramatic. Not angry. Just tired. I said, "I think we need to talk." He said, "Yes, we do." We met at a quiet diner a few days later. I got there first. Peter came in carrying a thick envelope and an old leather folder. He sat across from me and said, "I'm not here to convince you I was a good father." That was his opening line. I said, "Okay." I made mistakes. I missed things I shouldn't have missed. I let Judith decide that every interaction would be a war, and eventually I chose less interaction. He looked down at the folder. "That hurt, Leah. I know that." Then he slid the envelope toward me. Inside were copies of old checks, bank records, printed emails. Some documents were more than 20 years old. Others were recent. I didn't understand what I was looking at first. Peter pointed to a series of payments. I sent this every month. Child support. Some was extra. School expenses, medical costs, car, college help. I flipped through the pages. There were check images made out to Judith. There were emails where she asked him for specific amounts. There were replies from him confirming transfers. Then there were messages from years later where Leah thanked Judith for finding a way to cover something that Peter's records showed he had paid for. I looked up. Did Leah know? Not always. Why? Peter gave a small shrug that looked more defeated than indifferent. Because Judith wanted the money and the story. That sentence sat between us. He showed me an email Judith had sent him years ago asking him to cover part of a major expense, followed by another message warning him not to confuse the children by contacting them directly about it. There were other examples. Not enough to prove every memory Leah had about her childhood was false. Enough to prove the version I had accepted wasn't complete. Peter leaned back. I didn't come here to be the hero. I came because I was tired of being the villain in a story I paid for. I believed him. Not because the line was perfect, but because the documents in front of me made it hard not to. Then he showed me Leah's message. It was recent. She had written that she and I were separating and that I had spent years controlling the household finances. Then she asked Peter to confirm, if anyone contacted him, that he had noticed I limited her access to money. Peter had replied, "I have never seen that." Leah answered, "You know how men like him are? Mom dealt with the same thing." Peter told me that was why he contacted me. "She brought me into it," he said. "I stayed quiet about a lot because I thought fighting Judith would only hurt the kids more. But Leah is almost 40. She is about to wreck her marriage using the same story." I felt sick. Not because Peter was secretly perfect. He wasn't. Even from his own telling, he had backed away too much. He had allowed Judith to define him because he was exhausted by conflict. In a strange way, I understood that. That might have been the part that disturbed me most. I could see how a man convinced himself silence was maturity until everybody else started writing the history for him. I said, "Did you know about the money Leah sent Judith?" "Some of it." How? Judith asked me for help on the same problem. He pulled out another email. Judith had contacted him about Kyle's debt. She told Peter that Leah was doing everything she could, but Damien had locked things down. The date was after several of the transfers from our savings. So Judith was asking Peter for more money while already receiving ours. Peter had refused. That gave me another thread to pull. I went back through our bank records more carefully. I downloaded statements. I saved check images. I reviewed old bill pay histories. I found that several payments I thought were going directly toward Judith's expenses had freed up money she later sent to Kyle. Peter forwarded copies of emails he had. I saved screenshots of Leah's messages to him. I also went through old texts between Leah and me. Not because I was trying to build a dramatic case file. Because by then we were separating, and I no longer trusted verbal history. I found multiple conversations where Leah had asked me about large purchases, and I had answered without objection. I found conversations where I had moved money for her when she asked. I found no evidence that I had ever denied her access to our accounts. What I did find was a running list on a note synced to a device we both used for household planning. The title was Damien Refused. Under it were dates. Mom electric help. Kyle card. Mom car. Kyle rent bridge. Some entries had amounts. Some didn't. The list wasn't proof of abuse. It was proof of framing. She had been cataloging every time I said no, stripped of context. No list of what I had paid. No list of what we had agreed to. Just refusals. That hurt more than I expected. I could handle being angry about hidden money. Seeing myself turned into a pattern in a private note made me feel like Leah had been preparing a story in which the only relevant version of me was the version that denied someone something. About a month after the dinner at Judith's house, Peter came over to my new place. We had exchanged documents several times by then, but the meeting wasn't about strategy. He brought takeout. I had beer. We sat at my little table with moving boxes still stacked against one wall. The conversation was awkward. He asked about the separation. I asked why he had waited so long to challenge Judith's version of the past. He didn't get defensive. I thought leaving the argument would leave the children out of it, he said. I was wrong. I understood that answer more than I wanted to. We were halfway through dinner when someone knocked. I assumed it was a neighbor. When I opened the door, Leah was standing there. She looked tired. Not disheveled. Not broken. Just like someone who had spent a month expecting the situation to bend and had finally realized it might not. She said, "We need to talk." Then she looked past me. Peter was still sitting at the table. Leah froze. Her face went completely still. Why is he here? I should say this clearly. I didn't arrange that moment. Leah hadn't told me she was coming. Peter wasn't there as a trap. But when I saw the way she looked at him, part of me knew exactly how brutal it appeared. I said, "Because he got tired of being the villain in your mother's story." Peter closed his eyes for a second. He later told me I didn't need to say it like that. He was right. Leah looked at me. "You're using him to hurt me." "No." "Yes, you are. You contacted him first." "What?" "You asked him to lie about me." Her eyes shifted to Peter. He stood up. "Leah, did you show him my messages?" "Yes." She looked betrayed. The irony was so sharp I almost laughed, but nothing about it was funny. She stepped inside without asking. "You had no right." Peter said, "You asked me to tell people I had seen Damien control your money. I have never seen that. You know what I meant." "No, I don't." "You know what Mom went through." Peter's jaw tightened. "That is a different conversation. Of course you would say that." I cut in. "This is exactly the problem. Every time the question gets specific, you move it somewhere else." Leah rounded on me. "You are enjoying this." That landed. Because some part of me wasn't enjoying her pain, but I was relieved to finally have someone else in the room who could see the pattern. And relief can look ugly when the other person is losing control. I said, "I'm not proud of how this looks." "Then tell him to leave." Peter picked up his jacket. "I can leave." I said, "You don't have to." Leah stared at me. That was probably the moment she decided I had chosen a side. I had. Just not the side she thought. I had chosen evidence over loyalty to a story. Peter stayed. Leah didn't. Before she left, she said, Fix this before it gets uglier. I asked, fix what? Our family. I said, then stop telling people I controlled you. She shook her head. You still don't understand. Then she walked out. 2 days later, Aunt Carol called me. Carol was Judith's older sister. She hated public conflict, hated gossip, hated people airing family problems in front of outsiders. Normally, she was the kind of person who said things like, keep family business in the family. Apparently, family business had now spread far enough that she wanted everybody in one room. She invited Leah, Judith, Kyle, Rosa, Peter, and me to her house. I nearly refused. Then I asked myself what would happen if I did. Judith and Leah had already involved relatives. People were already contacting me based on things they had been told. I didn't want a tribunal. I also didn't want silence to become an admission. So I went. Carol made coffee. Nobody touched it. Judith started first. She said she was deeply disappointed that I had dragged old wounds into a marital disagreement. I said, Leah brought Peter into it. Judith looked at Peter. You have poisoned enough of this family already. Peter didn't respond immediately. Then he said, that is why I brought records. Judith laughed. Actually laughed. Of course you did. You always thought money could replace being there. Peter put a stack of copies on the table. No, these are here because you told people I didn't support my children. Leah said, Dad, this isn't about childhood. Peter looked at her. You made it about childhood when you asked me to compare Damien to me. Leah went quiet. Judith jumped in. She was scared. She reached out to her father. Apparently, that was another mistake. I opened my folder. Again, not one dramatic binder. Just papers from different places. Bank statements. Printed messages. Copies of transactions. I put the joint savings summary on the table. This is what I'm here to discuss. Rosa leaned forward. What is it? Transfers from our joint savings. Judith said, we all know Leah helped family. I said, $28,600. Carol looked at Leah. Is that right? Leah said, over time. How much time? She named the period. Carol frowned. It sounded worse when said out loud. Judith said, that money went to necessities. I looked at her. Some of it went to Kyle. Kyle shifted in his chair. Judith snapped, he is family too. I said, I didn't say he wasn't. Kyle muttered, I was going to pay it back. Carol asked, were you? I am. No, I said, you aren't. Kyle glared at me. You don't know that. I checked. Not one repayment went back into the savings account. Leah said, because things got worse. I turned to her. And you still never told me. You would have stopped it. Yes. There. You admit it. Rosa spoke up before I could. Leah, that isn't the same as him controlling your personal money. Leah looked at her. You don't understand what it was like. Rosa said, you told me he made you ask permission for normal spending. He questioned everything. I slid over 2 statements. These are large transfers. Show me where I stopped her from accessing money. Leah didn't touch the pages. Judith said, this is exactly how financial abuse works. He keeps paperwork so he can humiliate her. That was when Peter spoke. Stop. Judith looked at him. He pulled out copies of old checks and emails. You have used that word too easily for too long. Carol looked uncomfortable. Peter, we aren't reopening the divorce. We already did. He placed an old check image on the table. This was for Leah's college expense. Then another. This was for Kyle's car. Another. This was extra support Judith requested. Judith's face hardened. You are not seriously doing this. Peter kept going. He didn't dump every record on the table. Just enough. Dates. Amounts. Requests from Judith. Transfers from him. Rosa picked up one of the emails. Carol asked Judith, did he send this? Judith said, that doesn't change what kind of father he was. Peter answered quietly. I said it didn't. That disarmed her more than if he had fought back. Leah looked shaken. Not because she suddenly forgave him. Because the argument she had heard her entire life depended on a simple version of Peter, and he was refusing to play either role available to him. He wasn't saying he had been a great father. He was saying Judith had lied about the money. Those were two different things. I brought the conversation back to the present. I showed the transfers from our savings to Judith's account. Then I showed an email Peter had received from Judith asking for money for Kyle after she had already received ours. Kyle looked at his mother. You asked him to? Judith snapped. I was trying to solve the problem. I said, with everybody else's money. She looked at me with pure contempt. Money is all you care about. I had heard that line so many times that by then it barely moved me. I said, no, consent matters to me. Leah shook her head. You always make it sound so clinical. Because when I say trust, you tell me I'm making you choose. She stood up. You did make me choose. No, you chose secrecy, and then you blamed the secrecy on me. Kyle interrupted. I don't know why everybody is acting like Leah stole the money for herself. Nobody had said that. That was his defense. Then he made the mistake that changed the room. I told her I was going to pay it back. Leah said you would cool off. I looked at him. What? Kyle realized what he had said. Leah said, Kyle. He rubbed his face. I just mean she said it would be fine. When? He didn't answer. I asked again. When did Leah tell you I would cool off? He looked at her. Leah looked away. It became obvious. She had transferred money knowing I would object and told Kyle the conflict would blow over later. That meant this wasn't a desperate one-time decision made under pressure. It was a system. Judith said, he was in trouble. Carol turned to Leah. Did Damien know before the money went to Kyle? Leah said, not every time. That means no. I knew how he would react. Carol's voice got sharper. That is still no. Leah started crying. This time I did feel sorry for her. Not enough to erase anything, but enough to see the trap she had been living inside. Judith immediately reached for her hand. Sweetheart, you don't have to sit here and be attacked. Peter said, nobody is attacking her. Judith snapped, you don't get to speak. Carol raised one hand. Then she looked at Leah. Did you ask your father to lie about Damien? Leah froze. Nobody moved. It wasn't some movie moment where everyone gasped. It was worse than that. It was ordinary. A family sitting around a table, suddenly forced to wait for one person to answer a specific question. Leah said, I asked him to explain what he had seen. Peter said, you asked me to confirm Damien controlled your access to money. I said you knew the type. You asked me to say I had seen it. Leah looked at Carol. I was trying to make people understand why I had to leave. Carol said, had he restricted your access to the accounts? Leah didn't answer. Rosa said softly, Leah. Finally Leah said, not technically. That phrase destroyed more than a confession would have. Not technically. As if access to your own money was a technicality. As if the difference between a financial boundary and financial abuse was wording. I took a breath. I am separating. Leah looked at me. You already are. I mean, I'm continuing. She wiped her face. So this is what you wanted? No. Yes, it is. You brought records. You brought him. You wanted everybody to turn on me. I didn't bring Peter into this. You did. You knew what this would do to me. That was fair enough that I had to stop before answering. I said, I knew the truth would hurt you. I didn't decide that meant everybody should keep lying. Judith stood up. You have humiliated my daughter enough. I looked at her. I am not paying your bills anymore. She laughed bitterly. There it is. I am not paying Kyle's bills either. Kyle said, I never asked you directly. That has been part of the problem. Then I told Leah what I had already discussed with my attorney and mediator. I wasn't going to try to take more than my fair share. I wasn't going to empty joint accounts. I wasn't going to demand she repay me personally outside the settlement. But I would ask that the $28,600 transferred from joint savings without my agreement be accounted for in the division of assets. Leah stared at me. You're charging me for helping my family. No, I'm asking for the money to be counted. You hear yourself? Yes. Judith said, this is revenge. I shook my head. I am not taking revenge. I am subtracting myself from the bill. That was the sharpest thing I said all night. Some people later told me it was cruel. Maybe it was. But I meant it. I wasn't trying to destroy anyone. I was removing my money, my silence, and my participation from a system that depended on all three. After that meeting, consequences came slowly. Nothing exploded overnight. Kyle didn't get hauled away by creditors. Judith didn't become a social outcast. Leah didn't instantly apologize. Real life was messy, eh? Kyle had to call the people he owed and negotiate. He sold a few things. He took on extra work. He complained that everybody had abandoned him. Rosa finally told him, "People not paying your debt is not abandonment." That caused another family argument I was glad not to attend. Judith had to take over her own phone and insurance payments. She told relatives I had cut off an elderly woman out of spite. Carol corrected her. Peter didn't suddenly become part of every holiday. Leo wasn't ready for that. He also admitted to me later that part of him had hoped the records would fix his relationship with his daughter. They didn't. Truth corrected one story. It didn't repair 20 years. Rosa called me about a week after the family meeting. "I owe you an apology," she said. "You don't owe me anything. I judged you from what I was told." "That's different." "No, I still judged you." I appreciated the call. Not everybody changed their mind. One of Leah's relatives told me I had been technically right, but emotionally vicious. Another said having Peter at my apartment made it look like I was staging revenge. I didn't argue. I could see why they thought that. Even though I hadn't planned Leah's visit, once she was standing there, I hadn't protected her from the impact of seeing him. Part of me was too angry to soften it. That belongs to me. The separation process forced me to look at my own mistakes too. I had spent years acting like the only options were to pay or fight. So I paid. That kept individual arguments small while making the larger problem worse. If I had set clearer boundaries the first time Kyle needed rescuing, maybe Leah would have understood them. Maybe she would have rejected them, and we would have had this crisis years earlier. I don't know which would have been better. But I know silence wasn't neutral. It trained everyone, including me. Leah asked to meet privately about 3 weeks after the family meeting. At first I said no. Then she sent me a message that was different from the others. No accusations. No references to Judith. She wrote, "I need to tell you something without Mom there." I agreed to meet in a public place. She looked exhausted. We sat with coffee between us. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "I didn't think of it as stealing." "I know." That surprised her. "You do?" "Yes." "I thought I was keeping things together." "I know that too." She looked down. "Mom always said if we didn't protect each other, nobody would." I waited. She said Dad would leave. Then he did leave. He also sent money. "I know." "You know now?" She nodded. Her eyes filled. "I don't know what to do with that." There was nothing useful I could say. She continued. "I spent my whole life thinking she survived because he abandoned us. If that's not exactly true, then I have to question a lot of things. Probably." She gave a sad little laugh. "You're not making this easy." "I don't think it should be easy." She looked at me. "Do you hate me?" "No." That answer was immediate. I didn't hate her. That was part of why the whole thing hurt. She said, "I was scared Kyle was going to fail again." He did fail again. "I know." "And you covered it." "I know." "You did it with our money." "I know." That was the first conversation we had where she didn't attach, but to the end. Then she said, "I told people you controlled me." "Yes. I believe parts of it." I looked at her. She wiped her eyes. "When you asked where money went, I felt judged. That's not the same as being controlled. I know that now." I didn't know if she really knew it or if she was trying to save the marriage. So I asked the question I had avoided for weeks. "Why did you make that list?" Her face tightened. "The refused list?" "Yes." She was quiet for a long time. "Mom told me to keep track." That didn't surprise me. "What did you plan to do with it?" "I don't know." "Leah." "If we separated, I thought maybe I would need to show why." "Why what?" "Why I felt trapped." I leaned back. There it was. Not a conspiracy. Not a master plan. Something sadder. She had taken years of individual disagreements, removed the context, and built an explanation for feelings she didn't know how to name. Then she had used that explanation to justify hiding money. I said. You were preparing to prove I was the problem before you ever told me there was a problem. She cried. This time I didn't reach across the table. That was hard. 12 years creates muscle memory. A part of me still wanted to comfort my wife. Another part of me knew that comforting her too quickly was how we had both avoided consequences for years. She said, "Can we start over?" "No." She looked up. I said, "Not like that." "What does that mean?" "It means I'm not moving back. I'm not canceling the separation. I'm not pretending this was a misunderstanding." Her face fell. I continued. "If you want counseling, I will consider it." She grabbed onto that. "Okay. But only if you can do 3 things first." She waited. "Stop telling people I controlled your access to money. Acknowledge the transfers in the settlement. And no more money gets moved for your family in secret." She looked hurt. "You're giving me conditions." "Yes. That sounds like control." I almost laughed. Instead, I said, "Then we're not ready for counseling." She looked down at her coffee. A full minute passed. Then she said, "No, you're right. That was me doing it again." That was the first moment I thought there might still be a person underneath all the defenses who understood what had happened. It wasn't enough to make me go home. A few days later, Leah sent a message to Rosa and Carol correcting what she had said about me. She didn't make some giant family announcement. She didn't write a dramatic confession. She told the people she had directly involved that I hadn't restricted her access to our accounts, and that the dispute had been about money she transferred from joint savings without agreement. That mattered. She also signed off on the financial disclosure our mediator requested without trying to relabel the transfers as ordinary household expenses. That mattered too. Judith was furious. Leah told me her mother accused her of choosing me over family. The old phrase. The same trap. This time Leah said, "I'm choosing to tell the truth." Judith didn't speak to her for several days. Kyle called Leah selfish. Peter didn't push for contact. He told her, through a short message, that if she ever wanted to ask him questions, he would answer them honestly, including the ones that made him look bad. That was probably the smartest thing he did. He stopped trying to win. As for me, I kept the apartment. I kept the separation in place. I agreed to counseling after Leah met the conditions we discussed. Counseling didn't produce a miracle. Some sessions were ugly. Leah still had moments where she treated a boundary like rejection. I still had moments where I became so controlled and analytical that I sounded less like a husband and more like a witness. Our counselor called both of us on it. Leah had to learn that discomfort wasn't the same as danger. I had to learn that being factual didn't excuse shutting down emotionally. The marriage was still damaged. I don't know whether we will repair it enough to stay married. What I do know is that I will not return to the version we had. That version required Leah to hide things so she could keep rescuing people. It required me to pay for things so I could avoid fights. It required Judith to remain the authority on what counted as loyalty. It required Kyle to remain somebody whose consequences belonged to everybody else. And it required Peter to stay a villain because too many people had built their identities around that story. A few nights ago, I was putting away groceries in the apartment when I found a receipt in my pocket. I opened the kitchen drawer. There were only a few receipts inside now. Rent-related expenses. Groceries. A repair. Nothing from Judith. Nothing from Kyle. No insurance payment I had forgotten I was covering. No phone bill that had somehow become permanent. I stood there for a second with the drawer open. Leah used to mock me for keeping every receipt because she said I counted every dollar. Maybe I did. But the numbers were never the real problem. The problem was how many lies had been attached to them. I put the receipt in the drawer and closed it. Then I went back to making dinner. Leah had a counseling appointment with me the next day. I was going to show up. I wasn't going to run back because she cried. I wasn't going to slam the door forever because I was angry. The terms were simple now. Truth first. Counseling after. And no more money moving in the dark. If you liked it, don't forget to leave a comment and support the channel by subscribing. See you in the upcoming stories.